Hey guys, in today's video, I wanted to talk to you about how to get started with oil paints. If you've seen my art before, you know that I like to work with as many mediums as I can get my hands on, and one of those mediums is oil paints. And I personally am not the most versed in oils, and I just know a couple of things that work for me. And so I'm going to be telling you my advice on how to get started with oil paints. I just wanted to give a disclaimer that I am not like a professional and I don't know a lot of technical aspects about oil painting. I usually just use mediums that feel very comfortable for me, and I go with the feel of them rather than technical aspects of how they are made. But I have gathered a bunch of research, and with help from Carrie from Gamblin, thank you so much, I'm going to give you a lot of tips and advice on how to get started with oils if you are completely new to the subject. This video is not sponsored. I was sent some supplies from Trekell and Gamblin because I really love them, and they spoiled me with lots of new paints and some new supplies, and so I'm very thankful for them. But it is not a sponsored video. There is going to be a link in the description right at the top for a coupon code for Trekell if you want to check that out. I will have all the information down in the description, and this is one of the videos that I would really recommend that you check out the description because I'm going to be leaving a lot of resources for where to find things. So first off, we have to talk about the materials that you'll be needing. First, we have brushes. So long handle brushes are better for big paintings and short handle brushes are better for small paintings. I personally prefer short handle brushes since my paintings are fairly small. I like looking very close to my paintings. Having a long handle kind of just like pokes me in the eye. And in this piece, I actually only used 3 brushes. I used Trekell brushes, which are my absolute favorite. I used a filbert size 10 for the base wash as well as the final rough brush strokes. Then I used a round size 6 for laying down colors and blending, and finally a round size 1 for details. So I only used 3 brushes. It was extremely simple, and I can 100% recommend Trekell brushes if you'd like some really good quality brushes in general. I really do like Golden Taklon brushes, and so yeah, link will be down in the description. You can grab them with a discount with the code down in the description. It is not an affiliate link or anything, so I do not get a cut of the money if you will buy these products. I just do really like them, and I'm really happy that they gave me a discount for you guys. Secondly, you'll need a surface to mix your paints on. I've mainly used wooden palettes before, but glass is also a good mixing surface. In this video, I'm using some gray paper palettes that made by Trekell, and I love them just because I don't have to worry about cleaning them up after I finish painting. Usually, whenever I'm letting painting dry, I sort of forget about the palette, or some of the paint on the palette has already dried and it makes removing the paint a little bit difficult for me. You can also use a glass palette. You can make it from a picture frame. Just use the glass in that and put a sheet of gray paper behind it and tape all the edges around with masking tape or with duct tape to make sure that you don't get any cuts. That's a very inexpensive makeshift palette, and you can just use like one of those little palette scrapers to get rid of any dry paints on that palette. But I personally can recommend these paper palettes. If you're a beginner, I just think that they're super quick and easy to use, and it's low maintenance. Next, I would recommend a palette knife. They are very helpful. When I started out, I did not use the palette knife and I just mixed with my brush, but I don't really recommend that just because it will fray your brushes a tiny bit, and when you're mixing, there will be paint that will be caught up right at the top of the brush, and so it'll make cleaning the brushes a lot more difficult, as well as not ensuring that the colors will mix very well. So whenever you're going to be mixing all of your colors on the palette to begin with, I would recommend using a palette knife, and then as you're painting, you can use your brush to mix colors on the palette, but it's not going to be an intense amount of pigment that you need to be mixing. I bought a super cheap set of palette knives off of Amazon. I'm going to leave the link down in the description if you want to go check it out, but I would recommend these. They do what they're supposed to do, and so I don't really have any complaints with them. Next, you will need a surface to paint on. I personally don't like stretched canvases at all. My very first oil painting was made on a stretched canvas, and I didn't enjoy it. And I personally prefer canvas panels to stretched canvas, but in general, I do like working on wooden panels the most. If you're using a surface that has not been gessoed, you will have to do it yourself. Usually you will have to sand it down so that it can be smooth so you don't have the strokes from that gesso. The reason you will use gesso is to stop oil paints from penetrating into whatever surface you're going to be using, and it will help the paints adhere to the surface properly and give the painting longevity. So because oils are not my main medium, and as I said, I am not extremely technical with my mediums and what I use, I do usually buy already pre-gessoed boards or panels. Anything that I use, I will buy it pre-primed basically, because I don't really want to worry about doing that all myself. So that's what I would recommend for you as well, unless for some reason you want to gesso it yourself. I don't really know, but I definitely always use something that is already pre-primed. In this painting, I'm using an oil ground panel for the first time, which is interesting. It is a 1/4 inch Baltic birch from Trekell. It is an amazing board. This is the first time I've used it, and I really like the texture of it. In general, my ampersand boards that I use kind of like a student quality, I believe, or it's their economy quality at any rate. They are kind of smooth, which is just a little bit difficult to get used to because the paint doesn't grip as properly on the surface. And so for this board, the paint does sort of adhere to wherever you put it. It doesn't slip around. They're not expensive either, so I definitely recommend that you check out some of their birch panels or wooden panels at any rate. I really like them. You can also paint on linen, but I've never done it, so I can't really recommend it. Finally, you're going to be needing paint and mediums and solvents. I'm using artist grade Gamblin paints, and the reason that I can 100% recommend Gamblin paints and mediums is that they are as non-toxic as possible. There's kind of a misconception that when working with oil paints, they are going to be toxic for you, and a lot of oil painters, professional oil painters anyway, they will use gloves to protect themselves, and the great thing about Gamblin is that they are as non-toxic as possible. When working with oil paints, sometimes there will be some minerals that are toxic to use, such as there will be lead in some whites or Naples yellow in different brands, because lead will kind of add a worm tone to the paint so that it's good for figure drawing. But Gamblin does not use lead in their products, and same with cadmium or cobalt. Usually these pigments are pretty toxic, and that's why a lot of professional painters will wear gloves when painting. And the paint tubes are required to have like a little health warning on the back of them. But the way Gamblin formulates its paints is cobalt and cadmium are both dangerous if inhaled, and so they make sure that it doesn't flake. And the only way that you can actually be harmed by these is if you inhale them, so either if you spray them or if you sand them yourself. And so for cadmium, you can even eat it and it's not going to affect you. Of course, you're not supposed to eat your paint, but you can, which is interesting. And the only color that can actually be pretty harmful if eaten is going to be the cobalt violet, because there are going to be traces of cobalt left in your system. But of course, don't eat your paint, because I don't even think it would taste that great. The way they're formulated is that it can't actually seep into your skin and cause any damage that way, and so I don't ever wear gloves because it doesn't harm my hands at all, and you can just remove it with soap and water. I don't know all the details, so you can check their website out for more information, but all in all, they're pretty safe to use. Their mediums and solvents are also odorless and made as naturally as possible. They use a lot of natural oils instead of mineral spirits in their mediums and solvents, and so I actually, in my last video, I said that Gamsol was highly flammable, which is actually not the case. It's not flammable. And a good reason to use Gamsol, which is the one solvent that I 100% recommend. Even if you don't buy Gamblin paints, I would recommend that you get Gamsol because it is odorless and as non-toxic as possible. In general, I would recommend that you try out Gamblin products because of the fact that they're non-toxic, especially if your skin is a little bit more sensitive. It is a non-toxic brand and they try to be as healthy as possible. So Gamblin does offer student grade paints, which are the 1980 oil colors, and they do have a beginner set that comes with a birch panel and a solvent-free gel. So that all costs 30% less than if you bought all the paints individually, and that doesn't include the panel. I will have a link to where you can get that as well, and so that has all the colors that you would probably need as a beginner. So I just want to talk briefly about why I do not recommend cheap oil paints and turpentine to use as your solvent, because when I started out oil painting, I used some very cheap oil colors that came with an easel. You know how you can buy a non-professional easel and it'll come with some pretty inexpensive oil paints. I'm not 100% sure if those were actual oil paints or if they were water mixable, just because the packaging didn't say. Those colors felt very like glue, and they were extremely chunky and hard to mix, and even with the turpentine, which has a lot of vapors and it has a very strong odor, and you really need to use in a well-ventilated area or it will make you very lightheaded. The combination of all that did not help to create a good experience when painting, and the color payoff for those paints was horrible. You really needed to use basically the whole tube to get any color. So I definitely recommend some brand name student quality paints rather than some very cheap no-name brands. Usually I do advocate for spending less on art supplies, but I think that oil paints are the exception because you're still going to be paying a pretty big amount of money on whichever oil paints you're going to buy, so you might as well buy a brand name and a student grade quality paint rather than something that is just not going to work for you. And if you do not want to get student grade paints and you want artist grade, I'm not 100% sure about the difference between this next kind of paint, but I know that any paint that has the word hue in it, in general, it's going to be a little bit less expensive, and that can be for one of two reasons. It either has a lower concentration of pigment and more filler in them, so you do get a little bit less of a color payoff, but as a beginner, that's totally fine with you. Or it can actually be because the color has been mixed from a couple of different pigments and it closely resembles the original pigment while not using that pigment. So that can be because either the original pigment is toxic, such as in cadmium red deep, cadmium can be toxic, so cadmium red deep hue is going to be made with different pigments but mixed to resemble the original one, or it can be because the original pigments are very rare nowadays and they can't be found, so they just make something that's a substitute. Whatever you decide to buy, I would rather recommend student quality paints or paints that are a little bit cheaper with the word hue in them rather than really cheap paints. For mediums and solvents, you'll basically need Gamvar. It thins your paints and increases transparency and decreases dry time. It will clean your brushes and your palette, and it is also reusable. I've been using Gamvar since I switched off Turpentine because that was horrible. And for this piece, I also used Galkit for the first time, which made the paint thinner, but at the same time still very opaque. And I know it's supposed to increase transparency, but for me, it just kept the paint pretty opaque, which I liked. And I don't know why, I probably used it wrong, I have no idea, but I still liked it. And it will decrease the dry time a lot. It kind of has a consistency like a very light syrup, so it's a little bit more sticky, and incorporating it is a little bit strange just because this is the first time that I've used it. But I will definitely be incorporating it again into my paintings just because it kind of adds a creamy texture to the paints rather than how Gamvar just thins them out. When setting up your palette, it's useful to set it up chromatically. I'm left-handed, so I started it the opposite way that a right-handed person would start it with. So I started with a black, white, a green, and then I worked my way to a yellow. If you're right-handed, you'll just set it up the opposite way, from a yellow to the white. When mixing paints, it's important to remember the fat over lean. It's this big concept in oil painting. You use more solvent for the thin underlayers, and as you paint more layers on top, you begin increasing the fat by using color straight out of the tube with a medium rather than with Gamvar. For instance, you'd use Galkit instead of Gamvar. So after you have all of your supplies and everything set up, you're going to want to have a base sketch for your painting and then use a light wash of color made with a lot of solvent to begin establishing tones. I would recommend that, or even buying boards that have a gray or a cool brown tone to begin with, because it is much easier to have tones that are correct on a medium neutral kind of colored surface rather than on white. If you paint directly on a white, a lot of times it's a little bit more difficult to mix properly because you always have a feeling that the colors that you're mixing are a little bit too dark, and so you will tend to lighten up the colors until they are too light. In the grand scheme of things, they would be too light. And so it's pretty important to lay down your darkest darks when painting at the beginning, just so that you can gauge the contrast between the colors that you want in your piece. And for me personally, whenever I started mixing oil paints, I would always mix them a little bit too light. Just in general, I do that. I mix skin tones a little bit lighter than they're supposed to be. So whenever I'm mixing, the gray paper will help balance that off so I don't have to mix on a white surface. And also, I always mix a little bit darker than I think I need, and in the end, that turns out to be exactly what I do need. So I don't really trust my instincts. I mix the color a little bit darker than I think I would need. When putting down colors, I try to set colors where I want them to be, and then I'll blend the edges between those colors. This is much easier than setting down a base color for all of the skin, for example, and then trying to go in and add shadows and highlights. If you do that, if you try to mix over top of that, the shadows and the highlights will be much harder to achieve because they will mix in with the tone underneath. And in general, I like to paint alla prima, so everything all in one sitting. I don't exactly like to wait for layers to dry in my paintings, and so I don't know what you would prefer, but personally that's what I prefer. And so whenever you are painting, especially alla prima, it's nice to set down colors exactly where you'd want them to be, and then you just blend the edges between those different tones after you finish setting them down. I would also recommend using reference for your pieces and trying to isolate colors when you want to mix them. Don't be distracted by what you think the color should be. Just try to analyze undertones for the color that you're going to mix. For example, when painting darker skin tones like in this piece, I try to analyze what colors go together to create the different tones in the piece. So I did not just use a straight up brown for the whole piece, obviously, and I didn't just add white to lighten it or black to darken it. For instance, I added a lot of greens, purples, and blues, and even reds and yellows to the browns and the whites to be able to create different tones and a lot more interest in the piece. So I would recommend that you do add green and blue sparingly into your skin tones. They will mute them a little bit. If you just use a red and a yellow and a white, you're going to have a very saturated skin tone, and adding some green is going to tone it down a little bit and make it a little bit more lifelike. I would also recommend having a brown such as a burnt umber, burnt sienna, or asphaltum to mix into your skin tones. It's going to make it a lot easier to, for me personally, use a burnt sienna with a little bit of a white and a little bit of a green to create the skin tone, rather than just having to mix from a red and a yellow and a white and then a green and a blue. So I find that having a brown to begin with is going to help you a little bit. Lastly, to varnish your painting, I would recommend Gamvar. The thing about varnishing paintings is a lot of times on Instagram you see all the artists that do the really pretty pouring varnish onto the canvas or their surface, and then they use a brush to spread it around, and that's actually not a good way to apply your varnish. So what I just wanted to show you that the proper way to do it is to get an actual proper jar and to grab a varnish brush, put the varnish in the jar, use the brush to grab the varnish, and then you paint it onto your surface. So I just thought I would give you the little tip. The little Instagram videos are actually not really great for the painting, and that's not the best way to apply the varnish. So there you go. So I'm sorry this video is really long. I just talked about the very basics about getting started with oil paints. If you'd like a part 2 in which I discuss more mixing colors or what colors you can get started off with, if you don't want to buy an introductory set and you want to buy your own individual tubes, let me know down in the comments and I will possibly make a part 2 including some color mixing theory and some more tricks about how to actually paint. I hope this video was helpful for you and it gave you a little bit of a push in the right direction if you'd like to try some oil paints. I can just say that I personally do really like to use Gamblin paints. A lot of professional artists will use Gamblin paints, and I do like Trekell brushes. If you've seen me in the past, I do like them for their quality. However, there are going to be some cheaper alternatives out there, although both Gamblin and Trekell are not expensive brands, you know? They're just good quality. They're a little bit more pricey than your average seller on Amazon, but they are extremely good quality, and so I would recommend them. So yeah, links will be down in the description. Please check everything out because I'm going to have a lot of resources to how to set up your palettes, what colors you need, and paints, and where you get your palettes, and all that jazz. And thank you for watching. This was a really long video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave me a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos because I put them out every single Sunday. I will talk to you guys next week. Bye!